June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks over the coast of Normandy. The largest amphibious invasion in human history is underway. On 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, Allied soldiers pour ashore under withering fire. Paratroopers drop behind enemy lines. Warships thunder in the Channel. The fate of Europe hangs in the balance. Every minute counts. Every decision could mean victory or catastrophe. In bunkers along the Atlantic Wall, German commanders watch in horror as the invasion they've been preparing for finally arrives. They know they must act immediately. They need reinforcements. They need their reserve panzer divisions. They need permission to move their most powerful forces into position to crush the Allies on the beaches before they can establish a foothold. But there's a problem. The one man who can give that order, the supreme commander of all German forces, the Führer himself, cannot be reached. Adolf Hitler is asleep, and no one dares to wake him. For critical hours on the most important day of the war, as thousands of men fought and died on the beaches of Normandy, the German response was paralyzed. Not by Allied firepower, not by superior strategy, but by something far more absurd: Adolf Hitler's sleeping schedule and the terror his own staff felt at the thought of disturbing his rest. This is the story of why Hitler slept through the Normandy invasion, a tale of rigid hierarchy, fatal delays, and how one man's refusal to be awakened helped change the course of history. To understand how Hitler could sleep through D-Day, we must first understand the German defensive posture in the spring of 1944. By this point in the war, Nazi Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. In the east, the Red Army was pushing westward, grinding down German divisions in brutal attritional warfare. In Italy, Allied forces had landed and were slowly fighting their way north. And in the west, everyone knew the decisive blow was coming. The question was not if the Allies would invade France, but when and where. Hitler had placed Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in charge of defending the Atlantic Wall, the series of fortifications, obstacles, and gun emplacements stretching along the coast of occupied France. Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, took his assignment seriously. He toured the defenses extensively, ordering millions of mines laid, obstacles constructed, and gun positions reinforced. He believed the invasion had to be stopped on the beaches. If the Allies gained a foothold, he argued, Germany's fate would be sealed. But Rommel faced a critical problem. He didn't control all the forces he needed. The panzer divisions, Germany's armored reserves and most powerful mobile units, were held under the direct control of Hitler himself and the German High Command. Rommel couldn't move them without permission from the Führer. This created a dangerous command structure, where the man on the ground, who could see what was happening, couldn't act decisively without approval from hundreds of miles away. Rommel argued repeatedly that the panzers should be positioned close to the coast, ready to counterattack immediately. But Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, disagreed. He believed the panzers should be held in reserve, deployed only after the Allies revealed their true intentions. Hitler, characteristically, tried to split the difference. He kept direct control of the panzer reserves and refused to delegate authority to his field commanders. This indecision would prove catastrophic. As spring turned to early summer, tension mounted. Allied bombing intensified. The French resistance increased sabotage operations. Intelligence reports pointed to an imminent invasion. But where? Hitler became convinced the main assault would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. Normandy, he believed, might be a diversion. This miscalculation, fed by an elaborate Allied deception plan called Operation Fortitude, meant that even when the invasion came, German forces would be looking in the wrong direction. Just after midnight. British and American paratroopers began dropping into the French countryside behind the Atlantic Wall. Gliders landed silently in the darkness, delivering troops to secure key bridges and crossroads. The airborne assault was scattered and chaotic. Many paratroopers landed miles from their objectives, but it achieved one critical goal. It created confusion. German coastal units reported paratrooper landings. Then came reports of naval activity. Then, as dawn approached, the shelling began. Hundreds of Allied warships opened fire on the coastal defenses, pounding them with naval gunfire of unprecedented scale. And at 6:30 a.m., the first wave of infantry hit the beaches. At German headquarters in France, staff officers began receiving frantic reports. An invasion was underway. But was this the real thing or a diversion? Should they wake Rommel? Should they request permission to move the Panzers? And most importantly, should someone wake the Führer? Rommel wasn't even in France. By a terrible stroke of timing, he had traveled to Germany on June 5th to celebrate his wife's birthday and to petition Hitler personally for more control over the Panzer reserves. Weather forecasts had suggested that invasion conditions were poor. High winds and rough seas made a landing seem unlikely. Rommel had gambled on a quick trip home. He was wrong. When news of the invasion reached him, Rommel immediately began the long drive back to France. But the damage was done. The man who knew the Atlantic Wall better than anyone, who had the tactical sense to recognize what was happening, was hundreds of miles away during the most critical hours. Meanwhile, at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, the Führer slept. He had been up late the night before and had given strict orders not to be disturbed in the morning. His staff, terrified of his legendary rages, obeyed. Reports of the invasion arrived. Urgent requests for permission to deploy the Panzer reserves piled up. Officers debated what to do, and Hitler slept on. For hours, the most powerful formations in the German military, the very units that might have turned the tide on the beaches, sat idle. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, elite formations with experienced crews and heavy tanks. They could have reached the invasion beaches while the Allies were still vulnerable, still struggling to establish their positions. But without Hitler's authorization, no one dared to move them. It wasn't until around 10 a.m., nearly 4 hours after the first landings, that Hitler was finally awakened and briefed on the situation. Even then, he remained skeptical. He still believed Normandy was a diversion, that the real invasion would come at Calais. He delayed giving clear orders. The Panzers remained motionless. If you're enjoying this journey through history, remember to subscribe to WW2 Last Stand, where we bring forgotten battles, hidden stories, and untold final stands of World War II back to life. Those lost hours were everything. On the beaches, Allied forces clung desperately to their positions. At Omaha Beach, American troops faced murderous fire from German defenders positioned on the bluffs above. The landing had nearly failed. Bodies littered the waterline. Soldiers huddled behind beach obstacles, unable to advance. But they held on. And hour by hour, more troops poured ashore. Engineers cleared obstacles. Naval gunfire suppressed German positions. Slowly, painfully, the beachhead expanded. If the German panzers had arrived in the morning while the Allies were at their most vulnerable, the outcome might have been very different. The tanks could have punched through to the beaches, disrupted the landings, turned organized assault into chaos. But by the time Hitler finally authorized their deployment, by the time the panzers began to move, it was afternoon. The Allies had gained precious time to dig in, to bring up anti-tank weapons, to establish air superiority. And that air superiority made all the difference. As German armored columns attempted to move toward Normandy, they came under relentless attack from Allied aircraft. Fighter bombers strafed the roads. Tanks were forced to hide in forests during daylight, moving only at night. What should have been a rapid redeployment turned into a slow, costly crawl. Units that might have arrived in the morning didn't reach the battlefield until evening, or the next day, or even later. General Wilhelm Fowley, commander of the 91st Infantry Division, was killed by American paratroopers as he rushed toward the invasion zone. Other commanders struggled with confusion, contradictory orders, and the sheer scale of the Allied assault. The German response, which should have been swift and overwhelming, was instead fragmented and delayed. Why Hitler slept through the Normandy invasion became more than a quirk of history. It became a symbol of the Nazi regime's fundamental dysfunction. The military structure Hitler had created demanded absolute obedience to his will, but it also meant that without his direct input, the entire system could freeze. Field commanders who might have acted decisively on their own initiative were trapped by the need to wait for orders from above. And when those orders were delayed by something as mundane as a sleeping schedule, the consequences were catastrophic. By the end of June 6th, the Allies had established a foothold on all 5 beaches. Over 150,000 troops had landed. Casualties were heavy, particularly at Omaha Beach, but the invasion had succeeded. The door to Western Europe was open, and the German opportunity to throw the Allies back into the sea had been lost. To understand why no one dared wake Hitler, we must understand the man himself and the culture of fear he cultivated. By 1944, Adolf Hitler was not the dynamic leader who had stormed to power in the 1930s. Years of war, stress, and possibly deteriorating health had taken their toll. He slept irregular hours, often staying up until dawn and sleeping late into the morning. He surrounded himself with sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear and punished those who brought bad news. Hitler's rages were legendary. Officers who failed him, or who he perceived as having failed him, faced dismissal, disgrace, or worse. After the failed assassination attempt on July 20, 1944, Hitler's paranoia would reach new heights, leading to the execution of thousands of suspected conspirators, including respected military officers. But even before that, the atmosphere around Hitler was one of fear and calculation. His staff knew that waking him unnecessarily could provoke his fury. They knew that if the invasion turned out to be a diversion, if Normandy wasn't the real landing, they would be blamed for causing panic. So they hesitated, they debated, they waited for absolute confirmation. And in doing so, they gave the Allies the most precious gift of all: time. This paralysis also reflected a deeper problem in the Nazi command structure. Hitler had systematically undermined military professionalism, replacing it with loyalty to the party and to himself personally. He insisted on controlling tactical details that should have been left to field commanders. He divided authority among competing subordinates, ensuring that no one could challenge his power. The result was a military machine that could be brilliantly effective when Hitler's intuition was correct, but catastrophically dysfunctional when he was wrong or unavailable. Rommel, arriving back in France on the evening of June 6th, immediately grasped what had been lost. He threw himself into organizing the German defense, trying to contain the beachhead and prevent the Allied breakout. But he was fighting uphill. The delay in deploying the Panzers had given the Allies time to establish themselves. Each day that passed, more Allied troops, tanks, and supplies poured ashore. The window to stop the invasion had closed. In the weeks that followed, Rommel would come to a bitter conclusion: the war was lost. Germany could not win against the combined might of the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. In July, he would be implicated, probably falsely, in the plot to assassinate Hitler. Given the choice between a public trial and suicide, he would choose poison. The man who might have stopped D-Day if given the authority would be dead within 3 months of the invasion. The success of D-Day was not guaranteed by Hitler's sleep alone. It was achieved by the courage of the soldiers who crossed the Channel, by the planning of Allied commanders, by the sacrifices of the resistance fighters who sabotaged German communications, by the deception operations that kept German forces looking in the wrong direction. Thousands of factors came together to make the invasion possible. But the German failure to respond effectively during those first critical hours, the hours when Hitler slept, was one of the decisive factors. The panzer divisions that should have been racing toward the beaches sat motionless. The command structure that should have been flexible and responsive was frozen. And when Hitler finally did wake and begin issuing orders, he was operating on outdated information and mistaken assumptions. In the days that followed, Allied forces expanded their beachhead, linked up the landing zones, and began pushing inland. The liberation of France had begun. By August, Paris would be free. By September, Allied armies would be approaching Germany's western border. The Third Reich was being crushed between two advancing fronts. Hitler would never admit his mistake. He would continue to insist that his strategic vision was correct, that the failure was due to the incompetence or treachery of his subordinates. He would continue to micromanage military operations from his bunkers, even as the situation became increasingly hopeless. And he would continue to surround himself with yes-men who were too afraid to tell him the truth. The morning of June 6, 1944, revealed the fatal flaw at the heart of Nazi Germany, a system built entirely around the will of one man, with no mechanism to function in his absence. When that man was unavailable, because he was asleep, because he was ill, because he refused to delegate, the entire structure could collapse. And on the most important morning of the war, that's exactly what happened. History often turns on small moments: a message delivered late, a decision delayed, a man who slept while the world changed around him. Why Hitler slept through the Normandy invasion is not just a story about one morning. It's a story about the nature of tyranny, about what happens when fear replaces trust, when obedience replaces initiative, when one person's ego is placed above the collective good. The soldiers who fought on the beaches of Normandy, American, British, Canadian, and troops from a dozen other nations, did not win because Hitler slept. They won because they were brave, because they believed in something larger than themselves, because they were willing to sacrifice everything for freedom. But Hitler's absence during those critical hours gave them a chance. It gave them time, and in war, time is often the difference between victory and defeat. We remember D-Day for the courage it required, for the lives it cost, for the liberation it began. We should also remember it as a lesson about the fragility of authoritarian systems. Hitler built an empire on fear, on the cult of personality, on the demand for absolute obedience. And on the morning when that empire needed leadership most, it found only an empty room and a man who could not be disturbed. The soldiers who stormed those beaches did not know that Hitler slept. They only knew that they had a mission. They carried it out with extraordinary valor. And in doing so, they helped ensure that the nightmare of Nazi rule would come to an end. We honor them, we remember them, and we remember the lesson they taught us: that tyranny, no matter how powerful it seems, contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. If this story gave you a deeper appreciation for the turning points that shaped World War II, then join us here at WW2 Last Stand. Subscribe to discover more untold stories, forgotten battles, and the moments that defined the war. History is filled with lessons. Make sure you're here to learn them. Hit that subscribe button and continue this journey through history with us.